All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the December 7th issue of SIG-Auth. First on the agenda is a couple of announcements. This will be the last SIG-Auth meeting of 2022, so we will see you all in the new year. And the new SIG-Auth triage channel. Does maybe Mo want to talk about this?
Yeah, I just wanted to have, so like the folks that have been attending the triage meeting, we've just had like a side DM among ourselves as we discuss things, and that doesn't scale in any useful manner, especially since Slack doesn't really let you expand membership of that. And honestly had no need to be private anyway. It was just us talking about the stuff we discussed in the meeting. So I just made it an official channel so that way what I plan on doing is doing a bit more async a triage like throughout my week, and then posting whatever I'm doing in there so that way people can follow along if they care. But that's just trying to make this stuff a little bit more in the public, that way people know what we're doing. But the triage meeting is still at the same time. It's on Mondays at 9 a.m. Pacific, so it's open to anyone who wants to join. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, and now let's jump into issues of note. Does somebody want to give an intro on this one?
So I think this issue we were triaging 2 weeks back, and then one was a documentation update. And then I think I also added a comment about enforcing defaults, but I don't have my notes to see why I added that. But Mo, do you remember why we added the comment about enforcing defaults for this one?
I think what we had wanted to ask was, is there any thoughts or plans about having a different default behavior for PSA? So it's on, but when things are unlabeled, it's just wide open. I think we left that as like a undefined, like probably not, but we didn't commit one way or the other. I think part of the rationale for asking the question was, this is the clusters config on this is opaque from the outside, right? It is whatever it is. So like when things are unlabeled, you don't necessarily know what's going to happen. And in the cloud provider environments, you don't usually have any control on this. At least you can't directly set CLI flags. I think that was what we wanted to sort of ask, if folks had thoughts. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think
so. Specifically around defaulting. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit. Do you mean like a user should be able, or an operator should be able to specify a cluster-wide default for new namespaces, or do you mean that we would eventually like default this on for all clusters at the standard enforcement level?
Yeah, I think it's more of like what is our long-term vision on that default? Are we just happy with just leaving it as, if unlabeled it means privileged? And if we do that, should that be observable in some way?
Yeah, I don't think it is clear to me that this would be possible to ever enable in less than more permissive as the default. I don't know. What do you think, Jordan?
Yeah, without intervention by the cluster admin, which they can currently specify with this config, or someone taking action via the API, which they can currently do by labeling a namespace or putting the admission webhook in place to label new namespaces. I don't think we can ever make the like default be you upgraded a cluster and now unlabeled stuff is not privileged. Should the effective config be observable? Yeah, ideally, there's a lot of things about API server config that would be nice if they were observable. So maybe that would be a good first step. I know feature gates got exposed as metrics in 1.26. I don't know if metrics are the right thing to do for this, but there's like other admission config. What admission plugins are even on is a question that people ask sometimes. There's a lot of API server config. So if the goal is to try to understand like what is effective in the cluster, visibility to that to someone who has sufficient permissions seems like a good thing to push on.
Yeah, and suppose we have that does sound good. Like I imagine like a config Z handler where we expose more of the file config. We do already have the command line exposed under the debug handlers, but those would point to some file. Is that what you're kind of talking about? Making that file available via some config Z, inspect Z handler. And I guess the other question I have about this is, suppose a cluster administrator does actually want to specify a namespace, a default for new namespaces. What would be the mechanism for doing that today? How would they do that on a platform like EKS or GKE? Would they write an admission controller that labels namespace on create?
Yeah, that would probably be how they would do it today. I mean, like long term, something like cell-based admission, where if you wanted a policy that says every new namespace just gets baseline policy, like ideally that would be really easy and cheap to toss that policy into a cluster, and you wouldn't have to run a webhook, and you wouldn't have to like maintain anything out of tree. So like long term, that would be the ideal in my mind. But
yeah, that sounds pretty easy if we can put that up on GitHub someday.
Yeah,
make it happen.
Time-wise, we're 10 minutes in, and we have a lot of discussion.
Sorry, I will keep it moving.
Okay.
Cool. All right, next one. Let's see, cluster namespace. Who put this one up?
This is a cap for global environment injection, and I start the KP because there is an old issue for a long time, and this way makes them easy to inject some environment variables.
I commented on the cap. This seems more like a SIG node level thing, like configuration or injection or modification of pods. Pods generally start with SIG node. API machinery might be interested if the mechanics are admission related, and auth might be interested if there are security implications. But I would probably talk to SIG node first to see if this is a thing that has interest and seems worth building in.
I think I would see questions on this. Like at the time that issue was written, I don't think we had very good viable extension mechanisms like admission webhooks, but we do now. And so even a kept with the idea of an API where you can describe it or configure it, you may get a response that says the recommended way to do this would be to create this API and create an admission webhook to do it. rather than try to modify.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess the recommendation here is to get this on the SIG-Node agenda and go from there.
And I think David's point is a good one. Like, it specifically explain why an admission webhook approach is not sufficient for this.
Okay, fine.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, you are correct. We do have a packed agenda. All right, first up is external signing.
Yeah, so I'm basically reviving an old KEP. It looks like it's linked there. It looks like it got closed and pointed at a different issue, but was recently reopened. Basically, I want to revive the KEP and see what the thoughts are around it, if that's something we still want.
Yeah, I think that this is still a valuable feature for some folks. So I think I'm still supportive of getting this implemented. Are there any changes to the old KEP that you would introduce before beginning with the implementation?
Yeah, there's one small change basically around a race condition. The current KEP is designed to basically say, give me the key and then sign with this key, two-step process. If the key rotates in between, there's an issue. So now the new interface would just be, here's this thing, sign it, one step.
Okay, interesting. So it's a minor API change between list public keys and sign payload, I guess, with some race. Is that how I'm interpreting that?
Yeah. So the sign payload request would only have the payload, and we would basically just send the payload over and get it signed.
Cool. So yeah. All right, and it is all spelled out here. So yeah.
So to the KEP as a whole, though, having I don't know, spend an exorbitant amount of time on KMS v2 now, and really learning to hate that feature with every fiber of my existence. I'm just gonna put it out there. So I'm
Good motivation.
I am generally against this entire concept of this extension point, like using these gRPC things and shoving them at like core important parts of the API server. Because it takes things that could never fail and turns them into things that fail in horrible ways. This one is, in line to kubelet keeping pods working. The API as sort of described there, like I know I couldn't run in the environments that I have to support. So I think what I would want from such a feature is changes to the design or capability that sort of address what KMS v2 tries to address, right? By making it so that signing doesn't always have to call remote things somehow. So if we can come up with that, I think I would feel a lot better, because that's basically what KMS v2 does, is it tries to limit the calls to external callers as much as possible.
Yeah.
Jordan, I'm gonna say something. I feel like you have like a thought, but you.
Yeah, I was looking over the motivations listed in the KEP and trying to match that up to like what the
Yeah, I was gonna also ask
Micah had, there are other hands, so other hands go, and then I had a couple questions.
Rohit, I think you were first.
I just wanted to say, like, I I'm in support of having some support for external signing from API server. Right now, we have private keys living on the control plane nodes, which are long lived, and we federate, for example, with AWS. And like if you get access to that private key, it's a big breach, right? So I would want like kind of one way, something where I can have, where no one can see the private key, right? Like, so AWS KMS or GCP KMS, and I just send the sign operation to them, right? And I am like, internally, I have a patch which doesn't start this gRPC server, but like, which adds just like AWS KMS support directly using Jose.opaque signer in Kubernetes, but that kind of wouldn't be accepted here, right? Like I would love to have something like this here, right? Like I'm not sure if I have great ideas on how to do this, which will be supported upstream. If we don't want external like gRPC server, but I really hope that we have some way to not have long-lived private keys, which are so powerful on the control plane node. That's it.
Yeah, the motivations are largely the same, like as before. It's just more just updated implementation. And I think like we also have usage experience of actually using the previously proposed KEP and implementation for 3 years or whatever, 4 years almost. And I think like totally get Mo that like you might not be able to run something like this, but I think there are use cases that that wouldn't necessarily want keys not to sign if like the HSM isn't available or something. They don't want exportable keys.
Right. No, I mean, it comes down to if the feature exists, I'm going to have to implement it, right? So I'm sort of stuck, right? So I need the API to be expressive enough for me to be able to actually reasonably implement it and feel comfortable, right? That I won't cause complete havoc. I think I do still need a bit more crispness on, like, I think there was some stuff about like rotation and stuff and like around API server restarts. I don't think those are like significant motivating factors for a design like this. Like I think the core one is I don't want the keys on the host, right? I think that's my understanding. Please correct me if I'm misunderstanding them.
It's both. Like restarting an API server is in a big cluster is a disruptive process.
No, I mean I'm saying if that was a big deal, we can just reload the file. Like like we can just fix the API server.
Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean it's both. It's both. Yeah.
So I mean, I have no issue with reloading any API server config that can be reasonably reloaded. So if we wanted to, prevent that issue, we can just do that. So I think I'm just trying to understand motivations that cannot be sort of built on the existing entry point, right? And I think the core one there is, well, I just don't want the private key sitting beside my API server. Yeah. In sort of trying to think of ideas around this space, for whatever reason, the Jose spec includes certificate support, so you can technically you can build chains. So you could have some kind of hierarchy where you have short-lived intermediates or something. That is sort of the vaguest statement I have at this exact moment, but yeah, I think I want to see something that can be built that doesn't involve a one-to-one correlation between every signing operation and a remote call to some KMS. Or yeah.
So what if I want that?
Yeah,
I said can be built.
Okay.
I'm not saying a mandate, like KMS v2 does not mandate that. The reference implementation will have the capability of doing that, but you get to pick. You can have every single operation go call out to your key vault if you want. That's totally all right. It's more of I need the choice not to have that.
Isn't that trivial with this gRPC model though? Like your gRPC implementation could just hold some key in memory or on disk, or
That would probably
It's
be
not,
part
it's
of the
not so
KEP.
easy when you can't throw away keys. It's not so easy, right? And they all have to be synchronized across the API servers. It's not like KMS where the gRPC API makes it super trivial to have distinct key sets and then use the remote KMS to sort of break any inconsistencies. Can't do that here because it's like if I present a signed service account token from API server 1, API server 2 obviously has to be able to verify the thing. It has to be able to verify the thing for its entire lifetime effectively, unless ignoring hard rotation of credentials.
no, sure, but I mean, like, we handle that today, right? When you just we give key paper saver like 2 files, right? I guess I'm not seeing. It seems like a solved problem, but I'm not sure. Maybe I'm missing something. Like, yes, if you're operating a 3 control plane node cluster, you will have to be careful about the order in which you introduce new keys and phase out.
Right. Exactly. There's 2 separate flags on the API server. Here's what to sign with and here's what to verify with. So how is that different?
Yeah. So I think the difference here is I would want a sort of in the same way that I have asked for KMS v2, I would want a generic reference implementation that would work across any provider that you can just drop in. Right. So like assuming you can put it on disk beside the API server or have a UDS running. Like if you can show me such an implementation that would be open source and under one of our staging repos, I could buy that.
So basically an open source version of the 2 flags on the API server, that's just using the sub API.
Yeah, that could have distinct signing keys or some, maybe not distinct signing keys, but something like a key hierarchy that doesn't require remote KMS calls unless I want that. So if we can have that, sure.
Yeah, I think that's definitely doable.
Yeah.
I had a couple of questions. I couldn't tell if it was similar to what Mo was talking about, like JOTs can have like lots of different algorithms and even some sort of crazy things in their signature stanzas. Is this proposing something that could be so flexible that it would start putting like really, really unusual or obscure things in the signing stanza? And are we well, I'll stop there. I couldn't tell.
I think the motivation for this is mostly just to get sign. The biggest motivation is really to get signing out of the API server.
Okay.
When you do that, it's basically sending, okay, here's the payload.
Yeah.
And I want these bits signed. So the signer then would need to come up with the header and the signature, right? And could you introduce something crazy that does, some weird algorithm? Yes, but the API server would just transparently pass that back.
Yeah. Okay.
And then similarly, like for verification, the API server would plumb that back through over this API to say, is this verifiable or not?
Yeah, so I think I would not be okay with anything that didn't have the API server controlling the payload. So like the response from the signing operation should be the header and the signature, and the API server glues it together and makes the JOT. And if that doesn't work because you tried to futz with the payload, it just doesn't work.
Well, that would be part of the signing header, not the payload, right?
Yeah, no, I don't care about, so I don't really care about how you sign it as long as you sign the bits that I sent you. You don't get to change the bits.
Yeah,
I
that's what it includes.
I actually feel less strongly about that. I think that it is, I think there is potential for flexibility here. Actually, I think what we should do is we should create a PR that proposes these API changes. We should do the production readiness review and discuss offline and then in a follow-up meeting, because we have a lot more on the agenda. So does that sound good, everyone?
Thank you, Mike.
Yep. Rein us in.
Okay, we got an update from the policy working group. Would somebody like to present, or would you like me to just open up the PowerPoint?
Sure, I can share my screen. Might be easier.
Sure.
Jim, I made you co-host.
Yeah, so this came up. I guess one of the touch points was from some KubeCon conversations and the SIG meet and greet. I think we haven't been. I guess we haven't presented in a while or given an update on some of the projects. So I'm not going to go through obviously this whole deck, but it's linked. But this was a KubeCon presentation. Myself and I have Robert and Jaya are also on the call today. So we'll cover some of this, but really what we wanted to just summarize right now is some of the completed projects or things which are fairly, or published to some extent for the paper. And for this second item, I'll talk about where we are and what we, might want to do as next steps. And then we'll talk about some of the future activities we're planning or proposing or being discussed. So about a year or so ago now, we published a paper on Kubernetes policy management, talked about admission controllers. It's something we will, one of the interesting points is with cell admission, seems like it would be a good time to revisit and, kind of give some guidance on that versus admission controllers and how the two work together or where, folks would use one or the other. And so that's out there, and there's a link I guess here also in the next slide. So if there's any feedback, any thoughts on what a V2 would look like, would certainly welcome those. And then the next item here is the policy report CRD. So just very quickly, the intent here was to standardize on a custom resource that various policy tools, whether they're admission controllers or they're scanners of different sorts, could leverage. And we have created, I'll show some of the adapters we have done, and then where this has been used. And there's some challenges, of course, that come up with managing things like policy reports as a CR, but various projects have solved them in different ways. And then there's also mapping from the policy report to both there's to OSCAL for compliance, and there's a tool. I'll just jump to this slide. There's a policy report tool which also can run in cluster, which is part of the Kyverno project, which can provide a view, right? So just very quickly, I have this running on my local Minikube cluster. It's showing me all of the policy reports, in this case from Kyverno, but could be from any of these engines, right? Could be from KubeBench, could be from Falco. KubeArmor is also another adapter. And then, we're in discussions and open to kind of creating more adapters if needed. Let me pause there and see if there's any thoughts, questions on these two items. We have a question on what we do next with the CRD, because it's sitting in the workgroup policy repo. And I know back when we got approvals for that Git repo, we had discussed that the intent was to prototype it and then figure out where it goes from there. There is no controller tied to this. It's purely just an API definition for how different engines can standardize on a policy report, which of course seems like a good benefit for operators and admins. So any thoughts, feedback on either of these before?
Yeah. And just so this from that table on slide 7, that actually is these are the tools that have adopted the CRD. Is that what that means?
Correct. To various degrees, some of these were prototypes that we initiated from within the work group. Others have incorporated, like Falco and Kyverno natively use these. KubeBench, there's an adapter. So different tools have taken different mechanisms to generating policy reports. And then there's tools which consume the policy reports. The last two are consume the policy report. There's also, I should say, there's, on the commercial side of things, Jayan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's modules in OpenShift that use the policy report, and there's Nirmata and a few other companies are also using the policy report for dashboards and other higher level functions.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
correct. We have Red Hat has a product offering called Red Hat Advanced Cluster Management for Kubernetes that uses it at the hub.
I could say a couple other GRC tools are either working on it or are using it today.
So Jordan, I guess like an API review style question for you. Like, would this be something that someone would write a KEP for to basically state that I would want to make this into like an official API of some sort?
I assume it's using like a XSIGs or XKates IO style endpoint. I mean, if it's working and people have integrated with it, like migrating that to be a K2 API would mean everyone would have to change their migration or integrations, which is unpleasant. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it needs to change. If it's useful the way it is, and it's been stable and useful, I think that's fine. If it was going to start getting like bundled with Kubernetes, then we probably want to shift it. Although the more integrations it gets, the more painful it is to shift. So,
but I guess right now we are still in the working group repo for this. And if we want to, have a better process for making API changes, or if there are issues with democratization of like all the different, people that are interested, it might be good to move it to its own standalone repo like CRI API, and adopt like the KEP process for proposing updates. If you feel like that is where you're at, this looks like it has pretty substantial adoption. So that would make sense to me.
Okay, that sounds great. That's the guidance we wanted, and if there's some precedence on this, that's fantastic, right? Because this is purely an API. There's no controller or anything we want to publish, and okay, that sounds good.
I guess a quick question for the group: would we, even if we didn't ever move it into like a K2 API, would we still want to move the definition from like the working group repo into like an official SIG?
Yes.
Yeah.
And we have received that feedback, right? Because our repo says prototype, so that's somewhat of a deterrent for folks to build additional things on it. Although, there has been some adoption.
The secret CSI driver comes to mind as an API that a lot of things integrated with, and ended up in its own repo that had other things associated with it. But there was some good discussion around there about testing, like how do you test a thing where you have an API and then you have a bunch of different integrations with sort of externally controlled things. But so there's a little bit of prior art there, maybe, in terms of an approach.
All right. Yeah, we'll dig into that, and then it seems like then the next step would be to propose a KEP. That sounds good. That will be great to have this graduate to at least a separate repo, and we can of course continue maintaining it and receive feedback on it. All right. So those were the two projects we had, more or less completed. I'll let Robert and Jaya talk about some of the new projects we're discussing.
Yeah, just at a high level, and I know you guys have a packed agenda, so we can keep this super short. But high level, we seem to attract a lot of folks in the community interested in that more GRC perspective on policy. So some members have started to use the nomenclature big P policy for kind of that human understandable compliance policy, security policy, and then little p policy, things that everyone here is familiar with and configuring in Kubernetes cluster. And so a lot of the members are trying to bridge that gap. So we spend a significant amount of time on, conceptualizing and trying to build a vocabulary around how do you do that and what would that look like, and then how do you manage both those big P policies and little P config policies over time. And Jaya, if you want to jump in and some of the things that you've seen in the field, maybe that we could enrich that discussion. But that's kind of how we cut across several of the SIGs in that respect, that you can have configuration little p policy in a number of places, of course, in a cluster. So not everything is just going to be admission controller policy or security policy.
Yeah, I think what we are trying to do here is there are so many different personas involved, right? In terms of making sure that various controls for security, resiliency, etc., are operating to best practices. So, and some of them are more SMEs on the technology itself, whereas others are more SMEs on the compliance aspects, right? The compliance standards like PCI, SOC 2, etc. So how do we bridge the two gaps, right? And then bring them together. So that is what we are trying to do here. So what we did last year is we authored this policy management white paper. Now what we are saying is, okay, why do customers do policy management? It's a means to an end. And typically one of the end goals is regulatory compliance. So then how do we bridge what we did to standards such as OSCL that NIST has defined for compliance, right? So that is kind of what this item number 2 is. And again, we want to apply the GitOps methodology there as well. And then the first item focuses more on governance, which is another business goal. And governance could be for operational governance, it could be for financial governance, as well as compliance related aspects. So what we want to do is to kind of articulate how policy management can be used as a building block to achieve governance goals and best practices for that. So that's basically a white paper that we are authoring. So those are the 2 next set of goals we have for the group. Any questions, thoughts?
Yeah, looking forward to seeing the paper. That sounds awesome.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much for the update. I will take over the screen. All right. Is that it? Perfect. Okay, so Mo, all right. You have the floor.
So I think earlier this week, we were going over what we wanted to update in the KMS v2 KEP for like beta requirements, since we're nominally trying to target 1.27 for beta. And so we were trying to write out like basically unit and integration test requirements. So we don't necessarily have to dig in too deep here, but just, at a high level, what do folks think should be covered under those tests? So we're working on getting the reference implementation written now. The hope is to use that reference implementation in like integration tests and, work, make sure it all sort of works together. I also want to like see if we could build like a, not like a required test suite, but an optional one that actually configures like a real API server with everything running and an actual KMS plugin built using the reference implementation and just does stuff and make sure it doesn't horribly fall over. Anybody have specific thoughts on things they really want covered?
Yeah, I would like to have all of that run under written under test integration tests with the reference implementation and etcd. I think that'd be useful. I I guess there are specifics here. These all sound good, and we should add these to the CAP under graduation test requirements, I think, and track them there. And we can brainstorm a little bit more when we merge that CAP change. But yeah, these seem reasonable, and in general, I trust you all to make good decisions.
Were you mostly wanting to exercise the logic inside the API server, or were you wanting to exercise the reference implementation / other implementations of the KMS endpoint?
So my desire is that if you have sort of like a goofy remote KMS implementation that's basically just a local key, but you artificially introduce like a small sleep to simulate a network call. If you have such an implementation that's using KMS v2, I would like you to basically be able to encrypt like a large cluster, and it just kind of works just fine. Right? Because that's kind of the whole point of KMS v2, is that the outer edges that KMS v1 doesn't work so well on, those are the things that need to work better here, right? Like, so like while like storage migration and stuff, I think we'll be able to test pretty well in like a integration test that, you know, once we have all the APIs set up, I think we could probably reasonably test them out working correctly. But like the scale version of this is a little bit harder, but
okay.
That's probably
that makes sense. Maybe I would suggest making it clearer that the point of the E2E test is testing scale and behavior with sort of the lag that you would get from a KMS. Yeah, with that clarification, I like this a lot. I was going to suggest using integration tests as much as possible for all the functional aspects.
Yeah, totally. They just don't tell me if like the core checkbox of I can run this in my prod cluster by default is actually checked.
Yep.
Cool. Sounds good. Thanks, Mo. Yeah. Send us a CAP update, I think. That would be next step. All right. Daniel, you have the floor.
Did I hear my name?
Yep.
So I'm so sorry that I didn't show up last time. I almost missed this time too because I was double booked. But David pinged me in time. Okay, you're going to open up the CAP. That's great. I'm trying to remember the state when I last talked about this CAP in this forum. I think it has changed rather substantially since then. Let's see. I'll say the latest thing I did to it is I removed. So the basic idea is there's this stuff we're going to add to the schema, and the stuff that we're adding to the schema describes how you can specify a special permission verb for a given field in the schema, and it is somewhat hierarchical. So you could give like a particular permission verb to mean everything inside metadata, and another permission verb to mean everything inside metadata.labels, and another permission verb to mean a specific label within metadata.labels. All right, so that's like the stuff that we would add to the schema does that. And there's another aspect, which is whether a specific permission is covered by enclosing permissions or not. And you need this if you want to be able to add a field which people don't get right permission by default. And I went ahead and expanded the definition of what things are uncovered to satisfy David's criteria. So now if you wanted to, for example, have a specific label that only people with a specific permission could modify, you want to mark that specific permission string as uncovered. And then when API server is evaluating whether the change can go through, it sees that this is modifying a field which has a permission that's uncovered, and it has to check to see if that person has that permission. Let's see. Did that make any sense at all, given what people recall from last time we had this discussion? Basically, this satisfies the criteria that Jordan and David were asking for, as far as I can tell. And so the important thing is that this notion of what is uncovered and what is covered has moved out of the schema and into some sort of object in the cluster, which cluster administrators can configure. So the important thing is that this can be chosen per cluster, right? Because we can't just unilaterally move things and like make things into uncovered permission, even though we would like to, because it would break unknown amounts of users. And we don't necessarily know how to add a corresponding permission to the with like whatever auth-in system every cluster is using, right? So instead, we at least give the cluster administrator the ability to do that, right? So if they want to make something more secure, like they can make a particular permission uncovered and also give people who currently have the main permission the special permission in their own auth system, because they understand how to do that. I think I've talked enough, Mo.
So I was going to ask just some high-level questions. So do you imagine this uncovered permission set? Do you imagine like a default policy of these objects that we provide going forward, like as we add things and realize that or decide that those things should not be covered by default?
I believe that by default we can place new fields in this by default. I don't see a path for how we Kubernetes could take existing fields and put them in the system, because that would break existing workflows. If everybody were using RBAC, then we could do it, right? We could add a RBAC permission at the same time we add something to uncovered, and then like, I mean, you're not actually more secure because everybody that could have done it before can still do it, but at least you didn't break anybody. But given that people might not be using RBAC or might be using some other permission system, there's no way for us to like automatically grant the permission to everybody who might be impacted.
Yeah. So I would we?
But we could offer security bulletins and tell cluster administrators, look, it's a bad idea to let everybody write this field. Here's how to lock it down without breaking anybody.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe you, if this is an API, you could probably go further, right, and provide the YAML manifest of what you believe to be best practice, even if the
right
isn't that.
Right. We can provide the RBAC version and be like, hey, if you don't use RBAC, then you got to figure out how to do this in your own system, whatever that is.
Okay. The other question in one of the, I think it's right under the user stories, there's a bit about how labels would purely, you could only target specific keys, but in like I think finalizers, you said you could target specific prefixes. It was unclear to me why you couldn't do key prefixes on labels, since very often you give like
that may be an error. I may have been trying to say that we gotta choose. I don't know if we can. If we can write down anything we want, right? I think if label prefixes is what people want, then we should put that in the verb. It does seem like prefix is. It seems like prefix is the most logical thing to put in the permission system. I think David was asking for a specific field. I forget what. I have it listed in this somewhere. But it was like, if it's safe enough to just use the prefix and protect everything with that prefix, that seems preferable and more useful to me. If we absolutely have to do like both prefixes and like specific labels, then we would like right now there's only one slot to put a permission for a specific concept in the schema as it's written in the design. So if we need like 2 different parameterizations for a specific thing, then we have to like figure out. Also, the more parameterizations you have, the more things API server has to check. So I would really prefer if we just had one parameterization per field.
And is this uncovered permission set, is that a cluster scope resource?
That would, I was assuming it would be a cluster scoped resource. I'm trying to think of what it would mean if it were per namespace.
I think that it makes sense to have the description of what is uncovered be cluster scoped, but the authorization check could include the namespace for the locator of the resource being checked. So
yeah, I would expect that. Yeah,
you would basically have one definition of these are the way types are handled in my cluster, or fields are handled in my cluster, and then these are the authorization rules inside of my namespace.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think it would be kind of weird to have like the permission type system change per namespace. That seems like it would make it really hard to reason about who's got permission to do what. Additionally, like not all objects have a namespace, so what you have to have a both a cluster and namespace scoped version of this, and I don't know. It seems like it adds a lot of opportunity to make mistakes.
I know that fine-grained authorization checks were something that the cell admission folks were talking about. I'm curious if we could use the same sort of mapping for a particular field path, or like maybe comparing what it would look like to protect changing a label using this and protect changing a label using a cell-driven authorization check. Anyway,
I think it is worth discussing whether these two things collide or are both useful.
Yeah.
My current suspicion is that the fine-grained auth in this KEP could be implemented faster than the cell stuff can be implemented, and this is certainly simpler and has fewer moving pieces. I think there's maybe some argument to be made about like some things are policy and some things are permissions, and this is a permission system and cell is a policy system, where policy involves things that are hard to check in binaries.
So I see this as significantly different than cell admission policy as we described it today, right? I see the cell admission policy as making choices like if you are doing this and that, or I am checking the value you are setting here, and therefore I will run and create this secondary ACL check, versus this here is, are you mutating this at all? And this also allows someone to only modify a finalizer without getting all update authority, for instance, and the cell validation rules do not. So I see.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you were to do, if the only way to implement this with cell is to give people excessively large permissions and then trust the cell part to scope it down appropriately, so that's a significant difference.
So I trust David on. I know that we had issues with that we discussed operator lockout. That was a concern with the initial RBAC designs, and also I would be. It would be nice to have some bounds on the number of subject access reviews that we're actually issuing, and that those don't explode when people start using this feature. Yeah, and other than that, I think I trust David and Jordan to lead the review on this.
What how much can you expand this? Like as written, I think this probably at least doubles the number of checks. So how many multiples can you handle?
And to be clear, this doubles the number of checks if you have uncovered permissions on a particular type. And it doubles the number of checks if you do not have full update permissions and only have a granular permission. But in the case where you are not modifying an uncovered field and you have update permissions, this is a neutral change, correct?
I think that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
for
I
additional
agree.
kinds of requests that we don't currently support today, it's going to be more than double, but I expect those to be kind of rare. Right, like if you have the general permission to modify metadata.labels, but not the specific or not the permission to update that resource type, it's going to be at least 2 checks to validate you. One that you're allowed to use the granular permissions at all, and then one that you have that's a permission that specifically covers that. And if we set up recursive permissions or like hierarchical permissions, like first we check, do you have the general one, then do you have the metadata one, then do you have metadata.labels, right? Like those add up. It should be log number of fields and not linear in the number of fields.
Mm-hmm. All right. I think that's handleable if we make account for it in some of the authorizers. I know there's room for improvement in the webhook authorizer. I would really like to get to Sergey's item.
Tim has his hand up. Tim, do you want to make a final comment?
No, it's okay. I just review the cap offline and leave comments there.
Yeah,
I was gonna mention, does this cap motivate us to have like multi-subject access review, so we can just do one call and just be like, here's the 50 things I need to check. Please check for me.
I think that is actually potentially maybe useful. So we should consider that. Sergey doesn't come to our meetings very often. Can you let's hear him out.
Hello. Thank you for giving me space. We've been discussing in SIG-Auth whether we have any leftover permabetas, and we found this rotate coupled service certificate feature gate. So I came to ask whether there are any plans or help needed to graduate it to GA. Thank you for links you pasted below. I'm a little bit surprised that the GA will require more features to be added because it's already in production in so many places. So it's like, okay, it's already in production, everybody using it. Can we just GA with documentation and then have new features for people who need these new features? Or those are strictly required? So, I mean, depending on the answer, I'm like, we may find somebody to help or may not find somebody to help. Or like, we'll need more assistance, I guess.
What do you think, Jordan?
Yeah, I stuck those links in. I mean, the feature works. Like the API is there. It's obviously in use. It holds the information we need it to hold, and people have successfully written approvers and signers against this API. So I think for what it currently delivers, like it's stable, and it would be fine to mark it as stable. It's a little bit weird to have the kubelet have a feature that has it requesting certificates and have no in-project version or recommendation of how to approve those things. But that's sort of the nature of having nodes have generic ways of getting addresses. Like the Kubernetes project is agnostic for how nodes determine their addresses. And so we also sort of have to be agnostic about approving that a particular node owns a particular address. I would be +1 on marking the current functionality stable and saying if we want to have an in-tree method for validating node addresses, that's a distinct effort.
Yeah, I think that is, yeah, that would necessarily require another cap. Do you think we need to write a retroactive cap even though it's basically de facto GA, or
I think it's worth capturing the description of what it does and the couple open sort of unresolved things. I don't think it has to be a long drawn out thing. In the past, we sort of copied pasted design docs and described how it worked, and it didn't take long. So I think that's worth doing.
We did it for a couple of SIG-Node past like features as well. So.
Cool. Okay. Well, we can start tracking this then, and yeah, maybe discuss further on the bug to see if anyone wants to volunteer to get this over the finish line.
Okay. With this information, I also will try to find some volunteers or maybe help myself.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. That concludes it for our SIG-Auth meeting today. See you all in 2023. And I will bump the agenda items we missed up to the next one. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, all. Take care.